Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of prayer time, my holidays certainly have been full of news, sad news from around the world of violence that's hurt to the core. And it started to hit home when the tragedy happened in Nice, because my brother-in-law and sister-in-law were there. In fact, Keith said just the week before they'd been standing on that very street. But they checked in and let us know that they were not near that site. And so as I wondered about what to preach this morning, I thought about all that violence in the state of the world, and then looked at this reading from Hosea and thought, I think there's a message there we need to hear, one that's somewhat about violence, but about the other side of that as well. And first I want to talk to you a little bit about Hosea. He was what is called one of the minor prophets, the major prophets being prophets like Isaiah and Elijah. Now, he was a young preacher in the nation of Israel. And at that time, the people of Judah were split into two kingdoms because there'd been a fight over who was going to be king. And instead of settling the fight, one king just ran away and built his own kingdom. So there was two kingdoms in what we now know as Judah. He lived, as was told in the first verse, during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, who were kings of Judah, the southern kingdom, and during the reign of Jeroboam, the king of Israel, which was the northern kingdom. And Jeroboam was known as one of the wicked kings, and the nation was going through a difficult time when Hosea started preaching. People were living it up, as we say, and didn't have much time for God. They wouldn't have said that, of course, because they were faithful Jewish people. Instead, they may have said something like, it was just a case of not having quite enough time to meet the demands that God has made upon them. So as always, people didn't pay much attention to Hosea, this itinerant preacher. He spoke of judgment and chastisement. He said that God was going to rise up the Assyrian nation to punish the people, and that fierce and ruthless army would sweep across the land like a scourge. But the people really didn't pay much attention to him. And they said that Hosea's God must be a pretty vengeful sort to talk like that. Hosea tried to tell them that wasn't so, that it was really a matter of what we call tough love, and that this vengeance was getting their attention, and in fact was an activity of love. But they really didn't pay any more attention to Hosea when he talked about these things. In fact, they said, if God really is a God of love, then why does he let things get in such a mess? How could a God of love ever send a ruthless people like the Assyrians upon this land? And so Hosea found that his audience wasn't listening, in fact, was diminishing by the day. Now, people were polite to him face to face, but pretty much ignored him the rest of the time. They thought he was harmless, but didn't listen to his words. So Hosea gets to the time that he's rather discouraged. And God comes to him with good news and said, I want you to get married. I have a girl picked out for you. And God mentioned her name, Gomer. And Hosea's heart was all aflutter because she was the most beautiful woman in the neighborhood. he was definitely interested. But God said, I want you to know the whole story about this girl. I want you to marry her, but she is going to be unfaithful to you. In fact, she will become nothing more but a common street prostitute. But I want you to marry her anyways. Now, undoubtedly, Hosea was very puzzled by this instruction from God, but he married Gomer. And in fact, they fell madly in love with each other and for years lived together. They had 3 children, which God had said God would name. And so the first one was called Jezreel. Now, Jezreel means castaway and was a name of shame in Israel. And that's the name God picked for Hosea's oldest child. And in the course of time, there was another child born, a girl. And this one was named Loruhamah, which means not pitied. Imagine naming your little baby girl not pitied. It meant that God would no longer have pity on his people if they continued their stubborn, rebellious ways. Now there was a third child, another son, and God named this one Lo-Ammi, not my people. For God was saying, you are not my people in what you are doing, so I'm not going to be your God. God said he would name these children as a sign to his people. Now after this, there was no more children in Hosea's household. And that's when God's prophecy came through and Gomer started to run around on him. What a heartbreak it must have been for Hosea, because they had had a loving marriage. And one day she just left altogether to find her happiness somewhere else. Well, Hosea kept track of her and eventually discovered she was living with a man and they were having difficulty getting by. Not much to eat, not much money. So Hosea started going monthly and giving the man enough money for food for the 2 of them. But the situation there just got worse, and eventually Hosea discovered that Gomer was being put up for sale in the slave market. And he went to God and asked God, what should he do? And God said, what would I do for my people Israel? And so Hosea went to the market, the slave market, and he bought Gomer. It took him a while of bidding and eventually had to add a bushel of barley to his silver, but he won her. And as Hosea led her away from that market, he said, you must dwell as mine for many days. You shall not play the harlot or belong to another man, and so will I also be to you. He pledged his love to her anew, and that was all this poor woman could take. She'd got down to the very bottom, the dregs of life. But the love of this man broke her heart and then healed it again. And from this time, Gomer was faithful to Hosea. And so we come to the time in the book of Isaiah for today's reading. Now, the theme of all the readings this week contrasts a life of dependence on material things with a life of dependence on God. In Hosea and in Psalm 107, God's salvation and care is promised, even when God's people need to be disciplined and corrected. Isn't that a little bit like our love for our children? We love them always, but we may not always like what they're doing. When it comes to us making our way in the world, our quest for money and success can be an end unto itself, but will it give us the true happiness that God offers? Because it is in our relationship with God that we can find peace and grace and unconditional love. Ultimately, we all need to choose the priorities by which we live. Hosea did. He could have been angry and frustrated and given up totally on Gomer, but he did not. His love surpassed. One quote I read says, Hosea changed his sandwich board to read, God is love on one side and there's no end to it on the other, when he stood on the street corner belting out, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender, for I am God and not man. I am the Holy One in your midst. The prophet adds this lesson from his own heartache, and yet in the joy of restored love. And so whoever is wise, he says, let him understand these things. Whoever is discerning, let him know them. For the ways of the Lord are right, and the upright walk in them. This is both a story of tragedy, but of beautiful elements of this eternal triangle. There is the loving God, the sometimes faithless human heart, and the deceptive attractiveness of the world. But God's love never ends. This is probably your story and my story. And then God touches our sleeve in love, saying, my child, my name and my nature are love, and I must act according to what I am. When you tire of all your running and your wandering and your heartbreak, I'll be there to draw you to myself again. I will always love you. This is the story of God's love and God's heart, God's loving desire to make of his people the full persons God intended them to be. And the miraculous thing that there isn't a faith in the world that doesn't have that message of love, regardless of what we hear in the media. God is love to everyone.